Thank you for the opportunity to speak on a subject close to my heart, art and culture in revolution, at the Literature and Revolution Congress with the theme, The Anti-Colonial Status of Mankind. You have just heard Professor Sison's history of the anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggles and People's War in the Philippines. I shall now speak on how art and culture have been, if I may, choreographed into making such history. Art and culture predate history and civilization, as archaeologists have discovered. Primitive prehistoric humans left carvings and drawings that reflected not only visual primitive art, but also a way of perceiving and understanding nature and themselves. These artistic artifacts reflect their activities and practice in gaining ever greater understanding of nature and their own possibilities. We can safely say that art and culture accompany all human activities and social existence in their struggle to understand themselves, nature, and its laws. With civilization, classes and class struggle arose. In these class struggles, each class used art and culture to arouse, organize, and mobilize its constituency to try to whelm the other class. And so is this reflected in the anti-colonial, anti-feudal, and anti-imperialist struggles of the Filipino people and in the long history of the People's War, which is the subject assigned to me. The disparate rebellions carried out in different parts of the archipelago since Spanish colonial occupation matured into the first propaganda movement conducted by a rising bourgeoisie calling for integration of the Philippines as a province of Spain, preceding the advent of the Katipunan Revolutionary Organization in 1896, which called for Philippine independence through armed struggle. Though led by the worker Andres Bonifacio, the Katipunan continued with its predecessor's bourgeois liberal ideology. It recognized the importance of art and culture and continued these to conduct propaganda alongside the armed struggle and won the revolution in 1898. In what we now call the Second Propaganda Movement, the precursor of the re-established Revolutionary Party of the Proletariat, formed informal and voluntary discussion groups to study progressive liberal and Marxist-Leninist Maoist literature. They discussed ideas that they could not find in formal classes in the university. Later, they formed university-based groups and associations and put up their cultural, literary, and artistic instruments for their creative production of progressive propaganda literature, essays, poetry, and literary criticism. By 1960, they organized the Student Cultural Association of the University of the Philippines and expanded their propaganda vehicles to include frequent forums and symposiums, in addition to formal and informal discussion groups to attract more attendees and to increase their membership. This raised the political and ideological consciousness of SCAUP members and associates. It had guest speakers from outside the UP, or the University of the Philippines, as well as progressive visiting foreigners. The subjects included the semi-feudal and semi-colonial domestic conditions, imperialism, socialism, the Cold War, and other world developments that could not be found in the university curricula. These discussion groups predated the campus teach-ins popularized by the Students for a Democratic Society in the United States from 1965 to 1968 to oppose the U.S. war of aggression in Vietnam. SCAUP's initiatives served to break through the dominant climate of anti-communism flowing from the U.S. McCarthyite witch hunts and the religious sectarianism of the feudal, patriarchal, and comprador culture into the university and into the country. It served as a university within the university. Its objective of continuing the unfinished Philippine Revolution went beyond the UP confines and liberal parameters. With the defeat and almost total silence of the old merger party of the Communist and Socialist parties of the Philippines in most of the 1950s, SCAUP picked up the call of Claro Mayo Recto, a progressive nationalist and anti-imperialist, for a second propaganda movement, but went beyond his call for nationalism to adopt a socialist perspective. SCAUP also formed regular clandestine study groups to study such works as the Communist Manifesto, Dialectics of Nature, Materialism and Imperial Criticism, Wages, Prices and Profit, Mao's selected works on contradiction and on practice. Ideological work was very important because among the activists, not a few were somehow influenced by aesthetic theories and works, adhering to currents such as arts for art's sake, petty bourgeois self-titillation, mystical flights, or art supposedly transcending classes, but truly in the service of the exploiting classes. SCAUP cooperated with other campus organizations such as the UP Journalism Club, the Philippine Collegian, the UP Writers Club, and the fraternities and sororities to promote its political line and advocacies, such as the fight against the anti-communist witch hunt undertaken by the Committee on Anti-Filipino Activities in 1959 to 61, SCAUP members associated with progressive elders in the faculty, extramural intellectuals, and trade unionists. They connected with trade unions and built contacts with student leaders to initiate student and youth groups and organizations in other universities in Manila, such as Far Eastern University, University of the East, Manuel L. Quezon University, Philippine College of Commerce, Lyceum of the Philippines, and others. By 1963, Progressive Publications was established to publish progressive review and educational pamphlets to influence the students, young professionals, and artists. Aside from this, the progressive activists used campus publications and from time to time, liberal publications such as the Philippines Free Press, Kislap Graphic, etc., to which they submitted their literary and artistic works, press releases, statements, and manifestos for publication. They consciously made friends and recruited established journalists and writers. After Kabataang Makabayan, KM, Patriotic Youth, was established on November 13, 1964, the National Democratic Movement quickly grew all over the country. Realizing the importance of art and culture in the struggle, KM formed its Cultural Bureau to organize writers and artists of all disciplines, including directors, composers, and performing artists. The KM systematized and conducted cultural work consistently. More groups were formed. Social investigation and mass integration teams doubled as cultural teams to perform in factories, urban and rural communities, colleges, and high schools, where more performers were recruited and organized to popularize revolutionary songs and other art forms. Doing propaganda and cultural work among the masses necessitated the use of the national language or the regional lingua franca. Propaganda and other educational materials were translated into Tagalog and other major Philippine languages. English continued to be used for progressive review and other publications, including the book Struggle for National Democracy, published in 1967, which veritably became the Bible or basic text of the students and youth activists. KM campaigned for the national language as the principal medium of education and literary development. University professors and instructors, high school teachers, and writers in English were encouraged to use, write, and conduct discussions in Filipino. Tagalog and other local languages were used in the conduct of propaganda and agitation among the toiling masses. The cultural and propaganda performing teams conducted systematic social investigation, mass integration, propaganda, and organizing among the youth in urban and rural communities, in factories and school campuses, including high school, targeted for organizing into KM chapters. Aside from staging performances, they conducted discussion groups and meetings where urgent issues of the day were taken up, In addition to the educational materials they brought with them, consisting of the KM Constitution and Program and mimeograph parts of the struggle for national democracy. The schools for national democracy were organized. They flourished during periods of militant mass actions, especially during the first quarter storm of 1970. KM also stressed the importance of studying the works of the great Marxist-Leninist Maoist masters and other revolutionary literature among activists who were honed to conduct social investigation, integrate with the masses, and put what they learned into practice, in the spirit of following Mao's mass line of learning from the masses to be able to teach the masses. The October 24th movement was launched in 1967 to urge the students to engage in mass work among the rural and urban poor. In their mass work, activists learned at first hand the concrete manifestation of the evils of U.S. imperialism and their subservient domestic ruling classes of landlords and compradors, and the double exploitation and oppression these imposed on the toiling masses. They learned how to expose these evils, to imbibe the aspirations of the masses for a better life, and work out with them the tactics of fighting the manifestations of these evils in their localities. Thus, they were able to produce propaganda, literature, and art of social and revolutionary significance that easily resonated with the masses and inspired them to join the movement. Towards the reestablishment of the Revolutionary Party in 1968, intensive ideological, political, and organizational work were conducted. Aside from drafting and discussion, basic documents, including the rectification document, rectify errors and rebuild the party in preparation for the Congress of Reestablishment, revolutionary literature and artistic works were produced to inspire the masses. Philippine Society and Revolution was written shortly after the party reestablishment, presenting from the standpoint of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, the main strands of Philippine history, the basic problems of the Filipino people, the prevailing social structure, and the strategy and tactics and class logic of the People's Democratic Revolution. First mimeographed in the last quarter of 1969, it was the main study material for the party's primary course, but its circulation went well beyond the party, as this was published serially in the Philippine Collegian under the title Philippine Crisis and Revolution. Its first printed edition was published in the third quarter of 1970, followed by the first foreign edition published by Takung Pao in Hong Kong. With the founding of the CPP in 1968, cultural work became much more systematized. The cultural, the propaganda, and the translation bureaus were organized under the Education Department. More cultural groups were organized in the regions, provinces, and communities. NPA propaganda teams were dispatched to start social investigation, conduct mass work, and build the mass base for guerrilla operations. Among the first groups they organized were those of cultural workers, painters, reciters of poems, actors, musicians, singers, dancers, etc., especially among the youth and the women in the communities. Cultural work was well developed by the time the first quarter storm broke out. Groups such as KM's Panday Sining, Art Smithy, Samahang Demokratiko ng Kabataan, SDK, Democratic Youth Association, Gintong Silahis, Golden Ray, and the Philippine College of Commerce's Kamanyang, frankincense, did outstanding work among youth organizations in Manila and became models for youth and student cultural groups that proliferated in the provinces and regions. Performing groups arose in the late 1960s to present solo and choral singing, instrumental music, poetry recitations, dances, and skits, and to create illustrations on publications, posters, and walls in order to enliven and invigorate the meetings, mass protests, and workers' strikes. Writers and artists organized themselves. Panulat para sa kaunlaran ng sambayanan, Pen for the Prosperity of the People, Paksa, was founded in 1971 by creative writers in Filipino and English and other major Philippine languages, who were determined to serve the Filipino people. Fine arts and architecture students and young professionals from the University of the Philippines and other universities founded the nagkakaisang progresibong mga artista at arkitekto, United Progressive Artists and Architects, NPAA, also in 1971. Most of them were members either of SCAUP or KM and had been very much involved in propaganda work in either of these organizations. Many creative writers and artists joined the underground and the armed revolutionary movement and created more works about the dire social conditions, the sacrifices and struggles of the Filipino people. Literature and art flourished most among NPA propaganda and cultural themes with the masses in the countryside. The central and regional publications of the CPP, NPA, and NDF published songs, poems, short stories, and illustrations. Cultural organizations published, performed, or exhibited the literary and artistic works of their members. Songs, poetry, recitations, and educational lectures were popularized through audio cassettes, recorders, and players. Revolutionary songs were recorded and reproduced for distribution to the provinces and regions for popularization. They were performed in celebrations and community gatherings in urban and rural communities. Primary and elementary schools children sang them while at play. When martial law was proclaimed, artists and creative writers joined the underground and became Red Fighters, and at the same time practiced their craft. Their works were published in the revolutionary publications. Many writers and artists were abducted and tortured, became martyrs, and many more were imprisoned. Fascist repression took a toll as party cadres and members were captured and imprisoned. But it was futile for the fascist regime to detain them. Neither prison walls nor barbed wire fences could silence them in prison. They reflected on their experiences, maintaining their strong ideological viewpoint and political standpoint, nurturing and polishing their craft with even more revolutionary fervor and relevance. Arts and culture flourished and flowed out of prison to celebrate and inspire the struggling masses in songs, poetry, paintings, drawings, carvings, and myriads of handicrafts from materials they could find in prison. Though they lost grip of the gun, the imprisoned cultural activists firmly grasped the pen to inspire their comrades and friends outside. Wielding both gun and pen as artistic and cultural work also flourished among them. Prisons all over the country became crucibles of artistic creation, especially because, despite the deprivations, these were venues for reflection, even for those in isolation cells, and for continuous, regular, revolutionary education. Outstanding songs, poems, paintings, drawings, carvings, pins, cards, handicrafts, and others streamed out of prison. They could be brought outside in various open and clandestine ways, and were sold and circulated far and wide to help boost the spirit of the anti-fascist and anti-imperialist international solidarity among solidarity groups in Europe, North America, and other continents. Outstanding songs created in prison found their way into the public, were sung at mass gatherings and demonstrations, and reached the countryside and the guerrilla zones. Political detainees in various detention camps wrote and performed plays on the struggles of the workers, peasants, and urban poor. Likewise, reached the countryside and the guerrilla zones, also to be performed there by the masses and the Red Fighters. Despite intense repression, cultural and propaganda groups and cultural work proliferated. Elaborate stage presentations and socially relevant mainstream movies were produced. Many won national and international awards. Graphic and visual artists organized Kaisahan, Unity in 1976, which defined the artist's role in society, and produced works depicting the oppression and exploitation of workers, peasants, and urban poor by imperialism, feudalism, and bureaucrat capitalism. Cultural groups and organizations burgeoned in their various productions increased. Anniversaries of the party, NPA, and the NDF were celebrated with much cultural fanfare. Revolutionary songs and poems were recorded in cassette tapes and distributed to the regions and provinces for popularization, such as that one would know the guerrilla areas by hearing children singing them. Anthologies of literary works and songs were published in the Philippines and abroad under the direction of the party's National Commission on Culture. The Institute sa Panitikan at Sining ng Sambayanan, Institute for the People's Literature and Art, published Akdang Pandigmang Bayan, Works for the People's War, Ulos, Spear, and Dare to Struggle, Dare to Win, Hulagpos, Break Free, Mga Tula ng Rebolusyong Pilipino, Poems of the Philippine Revolution, and more. Revolutionary literary works circulated among the people in urban and rural areas. Lightning cultural performances were held even in city centers. Protest graffiti, periodic kits, and sticker posters of various sizes could be found on walls, waiting sheds, and inside buses and jeepneys. A collective of creative writers and illustrators were able to produce the illustrated version of Philippine Society and Revolution in Tagalog translation. Prison and Beyond was published in 1985 and won the Manila Writers Award and later the Southeast Asian Write Award. T-shirts with slogans and creatively designed placards and streamers to huge murals and papier-mâché effigies were displayed at big marches and rallies. Protest mass music and street theater became widespread and popular through many small musical and theater groups based in unions, urban poor communities, and schools. The resurgence of progressive and revolutionary art in the urban areas ran parallel to the constantly rising artistic and other cultural activities in the countryside. To this day, the richest source of literary and artistic works of revolutionary writers and artists are the central and regional publications and literary journals of the CPP, the NPA, and the NDF. They publish songs, poems, short stories, illustrations, and comic strips, aside from disseminating news and information about the revolutionary forces and the people in their respective areas. An outstanding achievement of Filipinos abroad and the Philippine International Solidarity Movement was the Permanent People's Tribunal session on the Philippines from October 30 to November 1, 1980. It found the fascist dictator Marcos guilty of grave and numerous economic and political crimes against the people in the Philippines and declared him unfit to govern and subject to severe punishment for his past wrongs. It also condemned the U.S. government for its role in sustaining, supporting, and pushing Marcos to act on the U.S.'s own economic and global strategic interests. The CPP and the National Democratic Movement in both urban and rural areas gained momentum and grew in size and strength during the pre-martial law and martial law rule of Marcos, despite the counterinsurgency strategy using the triad concepts of intelligence, CyWar, and combat operations under the AFP's Oplan Katatagan, stability. Marcos's assassination of Aquino led to an upsurge in the anti-fascist struggle that before long convinced the U.S. policymakers to drop Marcos, encouraged a fraction of the military to organize themselves into the Reform the Armed Forces movement against Marcos, and support the anti-Marcos reactionaries to try to drive a wedge between the rapidly growing alliance between the anti-Marcos reactionaries and the revolutionary forces. Marcos followed the U.S. call for a snap election. The U.S.-supported opposition candidate was Aquino's widow, Corazon Cojuangco Aquino, who since 1983, after her husband's assassination, had been working closely with the revolutionary mass movement. Unfortunately, the CPP made a tactical error by calling for an election boycott on the ground that Marcos would stack the cards and win the elections anyway. Thus, the progressive mass movement, or the advanced section of the broad masses, missed an opportunity to take advantage of the anti-Marcos electoral campaign as a venue for reaching the greater number of the masses, to raise popular consciousness from the usual politicking issues to more fundamental issues affecting people's lives, and to raise their struggle to the level of necessary reforms against the U.S. imperialists and the worst among the local exploiting classes of compradors, landlords, and bureaucrat capitalists that had further enriched themselves through land grabbing and corruption with Marcos in power. Indeed, Marcos won the elections by using sheer fraud and intimidation. But this further outraged the people, and again they took to the streets in hundreds of thousands. Ram took this as a signal and attempted a coup against Marcos. However, this was foiled by the Marcos loyalists in the military. Fortunately for the Ram, the mass movement combining with the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines, or the church, led by Jaime Cardinal Sin, and the Aquino supporters came to their rescue in the EDSA uprising that led more of the military to abandon Marcos. Finally, the Marcos fascist dictatorship fell. Marcos's fall catapulted Corazon Aquino to the presidency. She declared a revolutionary government and made good on her promise to release all political prisoners. The goodwill built through the United Front with the anti-Marcos reactionaries during the anti-Marcos struggle lasted for a while, but did not last long, as Aquino remained in the clutches of the U.S. and the military. Progressives she appointed to the cabinet were later removed or forced to resign. Repression returned with the Mindiola massacre of peasants and their urban supporters on January 22, 1987, and by February, Aquino unsheathing the sword of war. Behind the bourgeois constitutional processes, militarization and repression of the basic masses and the progressive forces intensified. Massacres, assassinations, attempted and successful, and all sorts of state atrocities occurred under the regimes Oplan Lambat Bitag I and II. These campaigns did some damage to the revolutionary movement but did not break it, despite the fact that these coincided with the growth of internal ideological, political, and organizational errors, which ironically resulted from the successes in the revolutionary armed struggle, but induced erroneous notions of quick victory deviating from the strategic line of People's Democratic Revolution through protracted People's War, of building strength in the countryside to surround the cities before the strategic offensive to seize the cities. The succeeding regimes of Ramos, Estrada, Arroyo, and Noynoy Aquino were not much different. Ramos revived the negotiations for peace negotiations with the National Democratic Front representing the revolutionary forces. The negotiations completed the first substantive agenda with the two-panel signing of the Comprehensive Agreement on Respect for Human Rights and International Humanitarian Law, or the CARIL. Notwithstanding the negotiations, Ramos continued his regime's counterinsurgency campaign, Oplan Lambat Bitag 3 and 4. However, the NDF and the revolutionary forces competently handled the propaganda and educational aspects of the peace negotiations and continued to wage tit-for-tat struggles to counter every attempt of the reactionaries and the military to undermine and violate the agreements reached. The start of the Ramos administration coincided with the start of the party's rectification movement. The significant losses in some parts of the party work, ranging from the party itself, the People's Army, the United Front, and the mass movement, drove the leadership to reassess their experience and identify the reasons for the revolutionary movement to fall into such threatening situation. They held the 10th plenum, which decided to conduct the second great rectification movement in all aspects of the party's work. The rectification documents reaffirm our basic principles and rectify errors, stand for socialism against modern revisionism, and general review of important events and decisions from 1980 to 1991 were issued and distributed for study by the entire party membership in a massive education movement conducted to reaffirm the party's ideological, political, and organizational line. The revolutionary forces worked hard in the recovery effort and overcame the series of deceptively named counterinsurgency plans of successive post-Marcos presidents after Aquino's Lambat Bitag, net trap, and Pagkalinga, nurture under President Ramos, Oplan Makabayan, patriotic under Estrada, Oplan Enduring Freedom, Bush so-called anti-terrorism plan, adopted by Arroyo, Oplan Bayanihan, mutual cooperation by Aquino the Son, and now Oplan Kapayapaan and Kapanatagan under Duterte. 3 more international People's Tribunal were held. The Permanent People's Tribunal's second session on the Philippines held in The Hague, the Netherlands, brought against President Arroyo and U.S. President George W. Bush on March 21 to 25, 2007. The International People's Tribunal held in Washington, D.C. on July 16 to 18, 2015, brought against President Aquino and U.S. President Obama. And the International People's Tribunal held in Brussels, Belgium on September 18 to 20, brought against President Duterte and U.S. President Trump. Generally, propaganda and protest art thrived from 1992 to 2016 with rich revolutionary substance and varieties. An abundance of books of poetry and short story collections, conferences and assembly proceedings, commemorative volumes of major and minor national and regional organizations were published. This particular period is very well documented in books, pamphlets, videos, internet blogs, and other media. Alter Media, People's Media Alternative Network, which describes itself as a network of independent and progressive media outfits, institutions, and individuals, was established in 2014. It conducts regular newscasts, commentaries on issues, and media production, training among mass activists and mass organizations. Tudla Productions, a multimedia production outfit, has been reactivated since 2011 to produce progressive and revolutionary videos reporting on current issues and cultural activities among the masses. Mass demonstrations, though not as large as those during the Marcos fascist regime and Aquino the First's regime, were enlivened with placards, tarpaulins, streamers, T-shirts, and elaborate effigies. Movies, documentaries, and theatrical productions were made on the history and activities of the revolutionary forces, including the protection of the environment, work with the indigenous communities, the U.S. war of aggression on the Philippines in 1899, and on Philippine society and revolution to mark the NDF 30th anniversary, etc. A major victory of the revolutionary movement in this period was the holding of the Party Congress in the fourth quarter of 2016, which was ceremonially capped with the celebration of the 100th anniversary of the victory of the Great October Secessionist Revolution in Russia. Party cadres and members representing the regional committees, staff organs, and departments assembled to strengthen the party's unity, amend its program and constitution based on accumulated victories and lessons, and elect a new set of leaders. The theme, Greater Unity, Greater Victories, guided the Congress in reviewing the party's 48-year history, taking stock of the current objective and subjective conditions, and reaffirming the party's determination to advance the national democratic revolution to greater heights. With renewed vigor, the party is entirely capable of confronting the challenges posed by the U.S. Duterte fascist terrorist regime. It is already well on the way to completely frustrating the regime's plans, Kapayapaan and Kapanatagan, whose objective is to destroy the revolutionary movement through violence and deception. The deadline for destroying the revolutionary movement has been moved from the end of 2018 to the middle of 2019 and further on to 2022. Having survived and prevailed over so many failed U.S.-instigated and supported plans from Marcos down to Aquino II, the party and the people are confident and certain that Duterte's plans would fail miserably and the National Democratic Movement would grow in strength and move closer to victory. The real intent of Duterte's feint at peace negotiations has been exposed as a mere maneuver to advance his desperate wish to gain absolute power through the imposition of a fascist dictatorship, with him as dictator for the rest of his life and perpetuated through his children for them to continue grabbing wealth through fraud and bureaucratic corruption. The underground revolutionary forces and the legal mass movement are growing. New alliances are forming to intensify the struggle against the tyranny and terrorism. A worldwide movement against Duterte's tyranny is gradually gaining ground and needs solidarity from peoples all over the world. Organizations of Filipinos abroad are expanding and strengthening themselves in building a broad, united front of solidarity organizations to expose, oppose, and fight the Duterte terrorist regime. Cultural workers and artists must now take up such protest themes as agrarian problems, foreign economic domination, export of cheap labor, exploitation of women and children, and ecological damage, while they express their aspirations for genuine freedom and combat the neoliberal attacks, including those on progressive Philippine culture. Let me cite 1 Billion Rising as a successful and vibrant propaganda campaign worthy of emulation. It started as a movement of feminist gender identity politics, but evolved to revolutionary politics by raising its demand to comprehensive anti-imperialist and anti-reactionary concerns. Now its demand goes well beyond the struggle against violence against women and patriarchy, to the advocacy of women's rights, the protection and defense of indigenous lands and the rights of indigenous people, struggle against fascism and tyranny, discrimination and racism, environmental plunder and destruction, corporate greed, economic violence, poverty, state brutality and repression, war, and militarism. The evolution of OBR owes much to its dynamically creative Filipino international coordinator, Monique Wilson, indefatigable activist, theater director, performer, as actor and singer, campaigner, organizer. OBR choreographs the truth of the people's struggle against the lies and falsifications of the monopoly capitalists and all their reactionary agents. It presents an excellent vehicle and opportunity for expanding and consolidating our artistic and cultural work. This means further organizing and educational efforts to deepen anti-imperialist and revolutionary commitment and militancy among the masses. Let us conclude with an exhortation to artistic and cultural workers. Let us train ourselves to understand and deal with facts and events as these unfold in the real world conditions experienced by the toiling masses. Let us not confine ourselves in ivory towers, honing our individual skills, imagination, and crafts away from the real world and the masses. Let us study current events, study history, immerse ourselves among the masses in their struggles, and in the course of our struggle, develop together with them the people's culture and art based on concrete realities. Let us contribute our utmost to the people's unified cultural offensive against imperialism, aware that its overwhelming dominance necessitates strong organizations with strong leadership, guided by the ideology, politics, and methods of the party of the most advanced and most productive class in our society today. Especially in this age of the internet and multimedia, let us also help build powerful alternative and counter media, powerful in that they are able to support the people's struggle and effectively amplify the people's voice, and in turn find resonance in and draw concrete support from the masses in their millions and billions. It is not enough for us to compete on shallow grounds with imperialism in such superficial terms as trending hashtags, viral YouTube views, and TV ratings. Let us avail of the electronic and digital media in our own revolutionary way. More important to us are the long-term results measured in the sustained growth by leaps and bounds of the anti-imperialist mass organizations and mass movements at the national and international levels. Let us help build many channels flowing in one general direction, many small rivulets of the people's struggles eventually conjoining into one endless current of strength to swamp the cultural bastions of the enemy. The essential task of progressive and revolutionary forces all over the world is developing unity, cooperation, and coordination of all peoples, and raising their level of struggle in order to weaken and defeat imperialism and reaction, in particular against imperialist plunder and war, led by U.S. imperialism, the foremost terrorist power, towards building a society that is just, peaceful, prosperous, and progressive. Thank you.